The leaders of the movement 90 years ago banded together for precisely the same reason that we still exist today. By coming together, they thought they could have more influence on issues facing their neighbors and communities, as well as on larger policies. They looked to their association to provide more power and amplification than if they functioned alone and independently. In fact, the early leaders, individually and through United Neighborhood Houses, which had a different name then, but is our predecessor, exerted enormous influence. Their ability to link what they saw in their communities, our early leaders, to link what they saw to policy issues, the phrase then was from case to cause, if people remember that, if they went to social work school, prompted them to set a robust social reform agenda, which they did. The original settlement houses in New York City still are members of UNH, but they have been joined more recently by other nonprofits that had different histories. Some started in the 1970s as community action groups as part of the war on poverty, funded by Great Society initiatives. Others emanated from organizations that grew up in public housing projects here in the city. Still others began as community development organizations, what we call CDCs, concerned initially about housing and economic development, then adding social services to their mix. Today, UNH's 38 members vary significantly by budget size and funding sources. Almost 2/3 of our member agencies have budgets over $10 million. So they have grown dramatically in the last 2 decades, mainly as a result of new government funding initiatives that were available prior, of course, to the current economic recession and today's anticipated government funding contraction, which I can talk about later. Settlement houses also expanded by entering new lines of business in response to emerging community needs, like homeless shelters and supported housing to address homelessness, workforce development training programs to address an insufficiently prepared workforce and high unemployment, and founding and operating alternative and even some charter schools to respond to the inadequate education available to children in their communities. Almost by definition, the contemporary settlement house is innovative and highly adaptive. I often say that if they had failed to continually adapt, they would never have lasted over 100 years, which several of our members have, and they'd still be offering sewing classes instead of computer classes. Thank you. However, no matter their origin or their age or how long they've been in business, each UNH member today shares certain characteristics. They are rooted in and responsive to a particular community, most often a geographic community, like the Upper West Side or the Lower East Side, but also actually now including communities of national origin, like Chinese American Planning Council, one of our members, which started in Chinatown and now followed the Chinese American population to Sunset Park and Flushing, and Arab American Family Support Center, one of our newest members that started in downtown Brooklyn and now has expanded to Bay Ridge. Second characteristic, they serve multiple generations. You won't find just a daycare center or just a senior center as part of our federation, and they offer multiple services. Everything from childcare to after school, mental health services, senior care, et cetera, et cetera. Here's where we come up against our history. I wish I could add to that list of key elements an investment and a commitment to community building and organizing, social action, constituent engagement, and empowerment. Unfortunately, I cannot. But while there certainly are many examples of organizations in our network, contemporary settlement houses, that engage in these types of activist activities, and I will discuss some great examples with you. One of them is here. It no longer can be said that this is the distinguishing characteristic of settlement house work today. Today, most nonprofit social service agencies in our city are predominantly funded through government contracts, some with as much as 95% of their budgets dependent on public sources. In our network, the average is about 75% government, 25% private. The consequences of this shift are profound. Government funding suppresses innovation. Activities under contracts usually are more prescribed and limited than those supported by philanthropy. Let me add here, and anybody who knows me knows this, let me add here that I would not want anyone to interpret what I just said to mean that I am opposed to government support of social services. Quite the contrary, I believe firmly that government has an obligation to support this work adequately and fairly, And I fight for that support every day in my job at UNH, most recently Monday and Tuesday in Albany, which I can tell you more about, a grim experience. Often the composition of boards of directors determines an agency's fundraising ability, which I don't think I have to tell anybody. However, this presents another conundrum. While private funding is usually necessary to undertake social action campaigns and the like, concern about alienating wealthy donors and board members who may be more conservative politically because of that activism can emerge as a barrier for some to these activities. I can say more about that if you want. Additionally, in Jane Addams and Lillian Wald's time, Lillian Wald was the founder of Henry Street Settlement and of the Visiting Nurse Service, one of our great pioneers. Jane Addams, I don't think I have to tell you who she was, but she was the founder of Hull House in Chicago. In their time, settlement houses were not the complex businesses they are today. To be a settlement house executive director today, one must be a fundraiser, a compliance officer, and an accountant, as well as a public relations expert and a world-class charmer.
Yeah, I don't know why you looked at me.
You're not an accountant.
The job is complicated and with many demands. So if you spend your time doing outside advocacy on social issues, it might mean you are not making the fundraising calls that are the lifeblood of your organization, nor replying to your hundreds of daily emails. WWJAD. What would Jane Addams do? Okay? I often wonder, what would the great social reformers Jane Addams and Lillian Wald do today? Would the demanding executive responsibilities of running Hull House and Henry Street Settlement allow them to be the innovators and rabble-rousers now that they were then? It's a question. I don't have the answer. Despite these constraints, I just went through, there are many great examples of activism and social reform in New York City settlement houses today. As in most areas of endeavor, leadership emerges as a key determinant. If the executive director of the organization wants to develop staff and participant capacity for activism and explicitly embraces a civic engagement approach and is intent on raising money to support the staff who do that kind of work, it can be done. Despite government funding constraints, donor caution, board inertia or conservatism, or the executive's lack of time. UNH member Cypress Hills Local Development Corp. In Brooklyn has created a successful educational change project in its low-income community in East New York, Cypress Hills. When this organization realized how poor the public schools in their neighborhood, particularly their high school, Franklin K. Lane, was, they undertook an effort to mobilize parents and students to demand change. Staffed by a full-time community organizer paid for with foundation funds, who worked over many years, they were able to move the City Department of Education to create a new middle school in their community, and they now work in the failing high school to incorporate new approaches. But note, this was a multi-year project that involved community residents heavily, a community organizing project. This experience highlights yet another challenge to activism today. Even the most enlightened foundations often will limit funding to 3 years, which leaves organizations scrambling to keep working on projects and issues which do not lend themselves to overnight success, like moving the New York City Department of Education. But Cypress Hills is still at it with a great deal of momentum forward. In Queens, one of our agencies, Queens Community House, formerly Forest Hills Community House, runs a program for LGBTQ youth as part of its youth programming. One of their staff people saw the extent to which young LGBTQ youth were being bullied in school and organized first a community coalition involving the young people themselves, extensively in advocacy, then a citywide coalition involving other interested organizations. Their program director had the full support of her supervisor and agency. Her time was freed up to do this. Sitting right beside me, I can't ignore the work in Manhattan of Goddard Riverside Community Center on the Upper West Side, my settlement house. They have had on staff for many years a community organizer position for which they have committed precious general operating dollars year in and year out. Is that correct?
That's correct.
This allows for continuity on community issues and a real ability to organize people quickly when the need arises, whether around a housing, education, or homeless issue in their community, and also to build a cadre of community leaders, just like the early settlement house leaders did. The board and executive director together of Goddard Riverside Community Center have made a commitment to continuing this allocation of funds. Again, from general operating, which might mean that other critical things for which an agency general operating dollars are used, like technology upgrades or employer contributions to medical insurance, may be trimmed. And I don't know if that's the case with you, but general operating dollars need to cover a whole range of projects in.
I have the tracks on my back too.
Yeah. But there are always tough choices in our business. In my 30 plus years in the human services field in New York, there has never been an environment of ample resources. I would argue that the challenge our settlement housing movement faces today is how to make the examples I've just cited the rule rather than the exception. In closing, I'd actually like to consider whether in fact our settlement house movement has been supplanted by our industry, and whether the imperatives of sustaining our agencies has trumped other, perhaps more noble agendas. The issues around which activism still occurs regularly in our system are funding and contracting. It actually makes a lot of sense when you consider that these are the bread and butter issues of our business. I'm not sure that Jane Addams would recognize some of the forms activism takes today. Nonprofit leaders today are invested first and foremost in sustaining their agencies and their services, and perhaps that's exactly the right choice, but we can talk about that later. As I suggested earlier, eliminating poverty and fighting for social justice are not necessarily in the job descriptions of our executive directors. Making sure their employees get paid is. I don't mean to suggest that current leaders in our field do not have a strong commitment to social justice. They do, we do. But I'm saying that their activism today most often coalesces around trade association issues having to do with procurement procedures, indirect rates on contracts, prompt payments, single audits, and funding and budget levels. In fact, much of the advocacy UNH itself does today is around city and state budgets, like trying to obtain a larger slice of the pie for human services and the people we serve. This is activism and civic engagement for sure, but it is perhaps more self-interested activism than social reform activism. Someone other than me will have to decide if this is a disturbing trend or simply responsible stewardship of important community institutions. I personally think that until the business model of supporting nonprofit organizations changes in our country, it will be very difficult to recover the spirit that imbued Jane Addams' work at Hull House or Lillian Wald's at Henry Street. Remember, Jane Addams did not have to worry about meeting payroll. She was independently wealthy and her staff were volunteers or students. Jane Addams did not have to hire a compliance officer because city and state agencies were not exercising oversight. Jane Addams did not have to produce outcomes and metrics for foundation funders. And if she put on an art show at Hull House, it was accepted that exposing people to culture was a worthy end in itself. She did not have to prove that as a result, the viewer applied for citizenship or her reading scores went up. So while there's a strong line of continuity between the settlement houses of the 1890s and those of today, they still offer vocational and citizenship training, for example. They still make art and culture accessible. They still care for young children. I believe government funding has profoundly reshaped the core work of settlement houses, and by so doing has narrowed and limited some of their external focus on social change. While settlement house activists today are more likely to focus on neighborhood issues like underperforming schools and pedestrian safety than national issues like child labor laws, I do believe they continue to make a huge difference in their communities. I don't think I could continue to do my job every day if I didn't. Thank you.